Okay, good evening, everybody, and welcome to our Iptop webinar series. As you're all coming into the virtual room, I'd like to welcome you on behalf of Professor Hans Hobelin, who's the president of the International Association of Physiotherapists Working with Older People, and myself, Mel Farley, and David Beckway, who is the other member of the Education Committee of Iptop at the moment. And I'd also like to thank you all for joining us this evening for this webinar, or very early in the morning, depending on which part of the world you're in. Some of you have got the middle of the day. It's late here in Australia. So I would like to just help you with navigating today's session. So down the bottom, you'll see a Q&A button. So use that button to post any questions that you might like to have asked at the end of the presentation that you're about to see. If you're asking questions, please use that Q&A button rather than the chat button. We won't be using the chat button tonight. And just a reminder that the recording of tonight's webinar, or today's webinar, will be uploaded to YouTube after today. It'll probably take us about a week to get it there. And then we'll also be having a couple of things coming out to you after. So we've got an evaluation survey. We'll post it in the chat during the Q&A time, but if you do miss it, please look out for the follow-up email and let us know what you think about the webinar program and any ideas for speakers in the future. So I'd like to now get started with our main presentation. So we have Professor Bautmans, who's here to speak with us today about vitality capacity, what it is and why is monitoring relevant. The presentation will go for about 20 minutes, after which we'll have Professor Bautmans for another 10 minutes to answer your questions. So please put them in the Q&A portal while the presentation is taking place. So I'm going to hand over to Professor Bautmans. Thank you very much for being at our Iptop webinar tonight.
So here we go. I think you should see my slides now.
Can see you and hear you, so I'll leave it to you.
Okay. Perfect, thank you. Welcome everyone. So my name is Ivan Bautmans. I'm a professor in gerontology and heading the Frailty and Aging Research Group at Vrije Universiteit Brussel in Brussels, is Dutch-speaking Free University of Brussels. So my assignment today is to talk about 20 minutes about vitality capacity. So let's go on. So yes, I have a few conflicts of interest, but these are mainly some competitively acquired grants. So no commercial conflicts of interest. So what is healthy aging, and how does vitality capacity is placed in this healthy aging framework? Well, the WHO has redefined healthy aging back in 2015 as a process. So it's not an end station, it's a process, it's a lifetime commitment. And so that process is characterized by the development and maintenance of functional ability. And functional ability is considered as one of the cornerstones of well-being at a higher age. And so as you can see in this figure, so the functional ability, which is here the middle square, depends on the one hand, intrinsic capacity, which are all the physical, mental, psychological, physiological reserves someone can rely on, and its interaction with the environment. So the capacity to make use of intrinsic capacity in a given environment, which can be more or less challenging, will define the level of functional ability. Okay. So why is this important? Well, as you know, and especially those people working in geriatrics and with aging persons, frailty is one of the main geriatric syndromes, and frailty is considered as one of the main barriers for healthy aging. When we look at the conceptual definition of frailty, it can be considered as a condition or a syndrome that results from a multi-system reduction in reserve capacity to the extent that a number of physiological systems are close to or past the threshold of symptomatic clinical failure. And so this reserve capacity in the context of frailty aligns quite well with the concept of intrinsic capacity, and more specifically vitality capacity, which I will explain you in a couple of slides. So intrinsic capacity, as defined by WHO within the healthy aging framework, is reflected in the definition of frailty as reserve capacity. And so reductions or loss of this intrinsic capacity is one of the triggers that it can initiate the development or progression of frailty. Now, one of the most cited concepts of frailty, and yeah, I must apologize, I didn't update here the number of citations, so you can add a few, probably a few thousand citations more. We are now in February 2023. So in May 2022, this concept was cited 12,000 times. I hope that maybe once I would publish such a milestone paper, but anyway, this is indeed a milestone paper describing the physical frailty phenotype. And this paper has been published in 2001. And in fact, it characterizes the vicious circle, which is initiated by loss of muscle mass, which has been defined as sarcopenia. And so, as you know, loss of muscle mass is a typical characteristic of aging. It starts quite early. And between the age of 30 and 70, we lose about 4 to 6 kilograms of muscle, which is huge. And so it's evident that at a certain moment in life, this loss of muscle mass will lead to substantial muscle weakness and thus loss of intrinsic reserves and specifically vitality capacity. Now, how does this relate to the evolution during life course? So, as you can see here, this is a figure that I adapted from the WHO framework of healthy aging. The blue line is representing functional ability, and it's usually been assessed with tests for functioning, like basic activities of daily living. And this tends to remain quite stable over time, as you can see. And at a certain moment, this line here, this red line, which is representing the intrinsic capacity, these two trajectories dissociate, where loss of intrinsic capacity is not immediately followed by clinical features as loss in functional ability. And this is, of course, very important, because if functional ability at a certain moment crashes, this leads to dependency, and dependency is, of course, a major issue in older persons, and it's not very evident to bring back people who are physically dependent to an appropriate functional level. And the stage that typically precedes this stage of dependency is frailty. Frailty, in fact, is characterized by an intrinsic characteristic, a risk factor for developing negative health outcomes. This can be mortality, this can be loss of activities of daily living, as I mentioned, but also hospitalization, physical limitations, falls, fractures, etc. We know that depending on the frailty definition being used, that about 50% of all community-dwelling older adults show a certain degree of frailty. So therefore, it's very important to identify here this moment when intrinsic capacity drops before it affects functional ability, in order to anticipate this loss and to prevent dependency to occur. So that it's a preventive challenge. Now, if we want to detect this dissociation between functional ability and intrinsic capacity, well, we need to be able to measure intrinsic capacity. And so today I will focus specifically on vitality capacity, but of course there are also other domains of intrinsic capacity. And as you can see here in this figure, intrinsic capacity can be expressed at the level of cognition, so cognitive capacities, psychological capacities, sensory capacities, locomotor capacities, and here vitality capacity. And so at this moment, the WHO is running a huge task force in developing new definitions for intrinsic capacity. And this should allow also the identification of evidence-based biomarkers in order to track the changes in intrinsic capacity in order to avoid further development of disability at higher age. And so very recently, locomotor capacity has been redefined by WHO. It was a work group where I was a member of, and locomotion capacity has been defined as a state of the musculoskeletal system that encompasses endurance, balance, muscle strength, muscle function, muscle power, and joint function of the body, which is quite a vague definition. For the vitality capacity, this is a working group that I took the lead of together with some colleagues and the WHO, of course. And so we redefined vitality capacity here as a physiological state, which is related to normal or accelerated biological aging processes. So it is rooted in biological aging. And it results from the interaction between multiple physiological systems. So, which means that many systems are involved. It's not unidimensional. And it reflects in the level of energy and metabolism, neuromuscular function, and the immune and stress response functions of the body. Of course, this is still a conceptual definition and is still somewhat vague, and therefore we needed to further operationalize it in order to agree upon top candidate biomarkers for evidence-based assessment and monitoring. And so that's what we did. So the next phase was to identify these biomarkers. And so conceptually, and this is important, vitality capacity is assumed as a conditional capacity for the other domains of intrinsic capacity to be developed. And so vitality capacity and changes in vitality capacity will be leading for changes, for instance, in locomotor capacity or cognitive capacity, etc. And so vitality capacity comes very close to the biomolecular systems of aging and accelerated aging. However, in our working group, we try to stick to the higher level physiological systems in order to being able to put forward biomarkers that can track or can can be considered as a proxy for these biological aging processes. And so we came up with top candidate attributes for vitality capacity for the domain of energy and metabolism, like cell-specific fatigue, muscle endurance, malnutrition, body composition, and biomarkers of metabolism, like glycated hemoglobin, for instance. Neuromuscular function, knee extensor strength, hand grip strength, respiratory muscle strength, and the immune and stress response of the body, which can be reflected in circulating biomarkers of inflammation, perceived immune status, so maybe some questionnaires reflecting immune status, oxygen saturation, and autonomic functioning. And so at this moment, we are actually running several systematic reviews in order to build a body of evidence for one or more of these biomarkers for being used in the assessment and the monitoring of vitality capacity. Of course, there are already a few, let's say, a few checks and balances that we made for these top candidate biomarkers. For instance, are these feasible to quantify? Are they also feasible to measure in low resource settings, for instance? Is there sufficient availability to measure these of devices and resources to measure these features? Are there any ethical concerns? Is it implementable, etc.? And as you can see, a few biomarkers, well, they match all criteria already, like self-perceived fatigue, muscle endurance, and also all biomarkers reflecting neuromuscular functioning. It becomes more challenging to, let's say, to identify biomarkers for the immune and stress response of the body that are easy to use, easy to implement, and also implementable in low resource settings, etc., etc. So this is still work in progress, of course. Now, I mentioned to you sarcopenia as one of the main counterstones of frailty, and as you can see, well, these biomarkers, well, they come very close to the measurements also of sarcopenia. And indeed, for instance, strength hand grip muscle strength, has been put forward as one of the main characteristics or tools to screen and to assess signs of sarcopenia. This has been put forward by the European consensus definition of sarcopenia, but also in the Belgian guidelines for sarcopenia, on which also David Beckway, you know, and who collaborates with us, has worked on this nice guideline. You can download it from our website. And so here the difference between the Belgian guideline and European guideline is that in the Belgian guideline, well, we consider also stages of muscle weakness. Muscle weakness is not dichotomous. It's not up or below. So if you consider the trajectory of changes in muscle weakness or muscle strength, people tend to start and stay quite long in a normal range. And at a certain moment, they cross here an orange zone, a risk zone, before they drop into the very low muscle strength category, which has been identified as a feature in European consensus. And so working with these stages already allows, in a certain sense, some monitoring, some tracking of the trajectories of changes in vitality capacity. And so if we put this body of knowledge again in this longitudinal framework of changes in functional ability and intrinsic capacity, well, the challenge is in fact to measure, to track these changes in intrinsic capacity and to identify the moment when this intrinsic capacity tends to drop before functional ability gets affected. And for instance, there are some devices that can be used very easily, or some devices that we also have been developing, like here, some kind of hand grip dynamometer, which is automatically being connected to a smartphone with a Bluetooth app. And it allows also people to self-monitor their changes of strength. The test results come into a dashboard in the hands of the physician or the physical therapist, who can indeed be alerted at a certain moment by the system automatically if indeed there is a change, an alerting change in intrinsic capacity reflected by muscle weakness, fatigability, etc. And at that moment, the patient can be contacted and further assessed, and preventive measures can be put in place in order to avoid further decline. And this is particularly important because we know that physical activity and physical exercise is a very efficient way to boost these physical aspects of intrinsic capacity and vitality capacity. And indeed, and also an umbrella review that we worked on together with the Belgian Society of Gerontology and Geriatrics showed us high-level evidence for muscle strengthening exercises in order to counter and prevent the occurrence and progression of sarcopenia. And so therefore, we need to identify those persons who become at risk for developing dependency, for developing changes in functional ability before this decrease in functional ability occurs. At this moment, our healthcare system tends to wait until the problem is really significant and impacts the quality of life of all the persons before undertaking action. And so we believe that by monitoring and measuring these changes in intrinsic capacity and specifically, vitality capacity, we can come in action earlier and avoid these disease and disability stages in older persons. So this is one of my last slides. We come back to the figure that I showed you in the beginning, where vitality capacity is considered as the conditional domain of intrinsic capacity for other types of intrinsic capacity to occur. And so monitoring muscle strength and fatigability can help to identify changes in vitality capacity and to track the longitudinal trajectory and identify that point when the intrinsic capacity dissociates from functional ability in order to put in place some exercise interventions, for instance, but also, yeah, maybe nutritional interventions, and maybe also try to take people out of social isolation to boost their vitality capacity. Yeah? And all this should contribute to better aging, healthy aging, and making older persons better. And so my really final slide is maybe some commercial slide, but no conflicts of interest, don't worry. It's just to announce you that we have, since a few years, we have a research master in gerontological sciences. It's an excellent preparation for students who are interested to have a research career in healthy aging. It's an excellent preparation for a PhD. And so if you need any more information about the program or of the lecture, if the questions remain unanswered after this lecture, you can contact me on my email address, which is here. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much for that presentation. If people have questions that they would like to ask at the moment, we've got a little bit of time to ask questions. But while we're waiting for questions to come in, I had a question that I wanted to ask was, so you're talking about the monitoring of strength and fatigability as a way of tracking this vitality capacity. Do you have recommendations about the interval of monitoring? Are you talking about monitoring that's weekly, monthly, 6 monthly? How frequently should it be monitored?
An excellent question. So we have evidence that for people who are living at home and are considered as being robust, so without physical dependency, that a weekly monitoring on 2 consecutive days is sufficient. Mm-hmm. And so it provides sufficient information about the week-to-week changes. And so to do the assessment on 2 consecutive days allows also to filter out some fluctuations. Everybody sometimes has a bad day or a bad mood or whatever. And so when you perform 2 consecutive measurements, this is being filtered out, and we can identify the real change, which can go downwards or upwards, of course. So that's sufficient. 2 consecutive days takes only a few minutes. Mm-hmm. In the setting of rehabilitation, however, it can be recommended to assess more frequently. I can imagine that, for instance, in patients who are hospitalized, that a daily assessment can be much more informative because their stay is only for 1 or 2 weeks maximum in hospital. And it is important to understand whether indeed that person is also recovering for his physical reserves during hospitalization. So it depends on the context.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So we've had a couple of questions that have come in. So one of the questions is, when monitoring, what would be your trigger point? Is it an ongoing decline or any change in grip strength? I guess your trigger for action, is it any decline, or do you have to see it for a period of time?
But when you start measuring, so you always start with a first measurement, right? And the first interpretation is, okay, it is a good or a bad strength, right? And so even if the strength is good, I think action should be undertaken to encourage and to give some guidelines to aging person how to maintain that level. So anyway, so that's the intake. And then when you do the monitoring, once that the change becomes significant, and we put a cap at about 15% of change, and you can consider changes week to week, but you can also have the average change of 3 weeks compared to the previous block of 3 weeks, right? Mm-hmm. Which shows you the longer time trends, as also during the COVID crisis, to track the number of infections, for instance. Mm-hmm. It's the same principle, but the question is can we identify the change timely? And of course, a change that is exceeding 15%, for instance, 30% change, this can be either an artifact or a severe change related to emerging illness, for instance, or trauma. And at that moment, it is really important to undertake action and to understand the causes of that change.
Mm. So I think that sort of answers one of the other questions that's come in. That's about, you know, the early intervention is a helpful intervention. And you sort of talked about that 15% change. Is that what you would sort of consider a sort of that clinically important difference in function to be saying, yes, we are improving in the right direction here? Is there sort of a threshold for that sort of, you know, how much improvement where you're saying that's enough, we're on the right track, versus actually we're not improving fast enough here, we need to do more?
At this moment, we don't have the clear cutoffs yet.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, the most instruments that are being linked to the top candidate biomarkers are instruments for which clinically relevant changes have already been published and identified and known. The most important is to understand which improvement is also reflected in a change and a protection for further decline in functional ability.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's something that we will only identify once we will implement the system in long-term intervention and follow-up studies. So we have already some indications, of course, that when you start interventions, for instance, in persons showing pre-frailty, then these interventions tend to be more efficient than when you apply the same kind of interventions to people who have a severe degree of frailty, right? Or disability, who already crossed this stage. So this pleads already for an early intervention, and specifically, exercise, nutrition, and social interventions are considered as the most effective ones in this context. But indeed, we need a trigger. And we need a trigger that is easy to interpret, easy to measure, not burdensome, and also evidence-based. And so we think that by means of assessing a physical feature, it reflects the energy system of the body, the strength aspect of the body. It's also been affected by inflammatory conditions. And so we capture a lot by measuring physical strength, for instance.
There was a question about your advice on tools for assessing fatigability, but maybe you could sort of address that. You were talking about, you know, there's various tools. Where's the best place to go for tools?
Yeah, but the best tool, we developed a fatigability test, and we go back to my PhD back in the early 2000s. But it's a very easy test. So it's based on hand grip strength. So you measure first the maximal strength, and then you ask the subject to squeeze as hard as possible in the hand grip device and to maintain that pressure as long as possible. And you measure the time until which the strength drops to 50% of the maximum. This is, in fact, the most easy and, to my knowledge, the best validated muscle fatigability test in gerontology and geriatrics. And so the device that I showed in my slides, I think I have one, yeah. So this allows to, let's say, to avoid using a stopwatch. You can capture the measurements immediately on your smartphone, on the dashboard. You can keep track on it. And we also demonstrated that changes in muscle fatigability are much more responsive than changes in maximal strength. Especially also in the acute context, when people show acute diseases, the recovery and also the delayed recovery can be captured with the muscle fatigability test, whereas the maximal hand grip strength test, doesn't allow to identify these changes in these patients. So I think that's probably the best candidate test for measuring muscle fatigability. So
not to be confused with scales that measure fatigue, as in sleepy fatigue. You're talking about muscle fatigability.
Muscle fatigue, yes.
Yeah.
But maybe in that context, also asking for surface fatigue can add an additional dimension, because we know also that those patients in whom the muscle fatigability or the loss of muscle endurance corroborates with a higher sensation of fatigue, that these are particularly the persons at risk. And also those who show more clinical signs towards pre-frailty and frailty. And so it can help also to ask for fatigue sensations. There are many scales for fatigue sensations, especially the physical domain of fatigue. And this can help if you correlate them with the muscle capacity.
Yeah, so there's sort of that subjective perception of fatigue, and then there's the objective measure of muscle fatigability, and you can work with them together. Yeah,
exactly. Exactly.
So I have also just had one more question come in about the utility of the frailty index in clinical practice to detect frailty. If that frailty index is the leading one that's recommended, or if there's any other frailty measures that you think should be used by clinicians.
There are, I think at this moment, more than 100 variants of scales to assess frailty. It would be pretentious to say that one is the best. I think the thing is that it depends on what type of frailty you are looking for. And so I think for physical therapists, probably the physical frailty phenotype as can be measured with the 5-item scale by Linda Fried, so which is weight loss, exhaustion, low gait speed, low muscle strength, and what was the other one? Low physical activity. So these are really domains that are in the domain of expertise of physical therapists. And identification of abnormalities on one of or more of these 5 items also allow the physical therapist to identify therapeutical targets. Because if you measure something that you cannot tackle therapeutically, well, is it really relevant for your practice? So I think that in the context of physical therapy, that physical frailty phenotype is probably one of the most accessible and useful for physical therapists. But of course, there are many other scales that measure additional domains of frailty. And I don't say here that the physical frailty phenotype is superior to other frailty scales, but for physical therapy practice, I would recommend that one.
So just, as a final wrapping up question, could you talk a little bit about the WHO group that you're working with, and what work is happening in this space to help make information available for clinicians about this area of practice, and sort of centralizing information and places to go to find out more what's happening in that space?
Yes. So at this moment, as I said, WHO, there's an airplane crossing here my roof, so I hope you
can't hear it.
Welcome to Brussels. Very close to the airport. Well, WHO is indeed at this moment running a task force. Their ambition is to publish, I think by summer, some official recommendations on biomarkers to assess the different domains of healthy aging. And so these will be focused on intrinsic capacity, but also functional ability and quality of life, which is the outcome of healthy aging. And so, as I said, at this moment, there are different working groups that are being led by academic centers, where WHO is providing some logistic support too. And so these academic centers and working groups are at this moment running systematic literature reviews in order to come up with the existing body of evidence for the use of one or more of these biomarkers. And then based on these systematic reviews, an independent panel of the WHO will gather all these evidence and will provide, let's say, some recommendations on whether to use one or more of these biomarkers. So I expect that by summer on the WHO website, you will be able to find more information on this.
Mm-hmm. And so is that where the people will be able to get more information about how the different domains kind of intersect with each other, and how, because it does seem that the locomotion and vitality capacity have some overlap. There's probably some overlap with others. Do you think that is important for people to understand that granular detail for clinical practice? Does it make a difference?
I think so. More, I'm convinced, because but for instance, indeed, there is an overlap. There can be an overlap between locomotion and vitality capacity, especially for the muscle strength. Whereas the muscle strength dimension in the locomotion domain is more reflected in that strength that is being developed during a locomotor task, like, for instance, getting up from a chair. But we know that to be able to do a chair stand test, for instance, to do several stands in a certain time, you need much more than only muscle strength. Balance, coordination, etc., etc. And so in the vitality capacity domain of neuromuscular strength, it is really about the capacity of the neuromuscular system to develop a muscle contraction and the quality of that muscle contraction. Which comes much more closely to the physiology, whereas in the locomotion domain, well, they are looking more into integrated parts. And the importance, for instance, for clinicians to distinguish is that it is to be expected that changes will occur more rapidly in the more fundamental vitality domain and more easily to detect early changes before they come into expression to the more integrated aspects, like in locomotor tests. And so therefore, I think, especially for the preventive approach, it is important to make use of these biomarkers of vitality capacity in order to come in time before the deficits at the locomotor level become apparent. Because at that moment, I think, well, maybe it's already too late. We could have done something earlier.
Yeah, I think, I mean, it kind of also goes the other way potentially as well. If you're working in a rehabilitation context and function isn't changing, but you can demonstrate that vitality capacity is changing, you could mount an argument to keep going with a rehabilitation admission, for example.
Exactly, because also the increase in the vitality capacity domain will not only transfer to locomotion, but also to the other
others,
domains. Cognition, mood, sensory capacity. And so these are all capacities that people are maybe not focused on when they are focused on rehabilitation of that broken hip or that knee joint replacement, for instance.
Yeah, so it really kind of does get to that crux of why vitality capacity is at the center of it all.
Yeah.
Excellent. I think with that, we'll bring the webinar to a close, but on behalf of Iptop and the education community, I'd just like to thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and this information with the Iptop community. I think it's been excellent. Summary, you've done a lot of complex information in a very short amount of time, and we appreciate you sharing that knowledge with us. So thank you so much.
It was a pleasure.
No worries. And we'll say goodbye to everybody now. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.